Good evening. Tonight at the Forbidden Dispensary, we're opening with something a touch sharp, a touch luminous, and far more world-shaping than its unassuming mug lets on. This is the full saga of caffeine, the molecule that wired the modern age. Push aside the soft-focus café fantasy. What passes for a lazy little ritual is, underneath, a chronicle of trade winds and tax books, of colonial estates and unruly coffeehouses, of sleepless tinkerers and workers keeping engines humming, sometimes literally at the expense of their nights. The reality is simple. If we dropped you, without warning, into a candlelit coffeehouse where upheavals were debated, or onto a factory floor already spinning before sunrise, you wouldn't make it through the day without that hit. Before you sink in, tap like and subscribe only if this kind of deep dive honestly hits home for you. Drop a comment with where you're tuning in from and what time it is on your clock. I never stop being amazed at how this scattered little community spans the globe. Now dim the lights, settle in, and walk with the Forbidden Dispensary into tonight's story. There are pockets on this planet where the earth itself tastes like alertness. High along an Ethiopian mountainside, in a damp hollow of Amazon jungle, beneath the layered shade of a West African forest. Up a stepped Chinese hillside, carved into terraces like a staircase moving in slow motion. There, whether by pure chance or deliberate experiment, people found small green leaves, bright red cherries, hard white seeds, and plump brown beans that when chewed, steeped, roasted, pounded, or married to fire and water changed how fast the mind ran. Botanically speaking, these are not the same deity in different masks. Camellia sinensis climbs the fog-wrapped ridges of East Asia with glossy leaves and a flavor that can be teased from floral to sharply tannic with the slightest shift in handling. Coffea arabica pulls its sweet acid bite from the cool plateaus of the Ethiopian highlands and the ragged western edge of the Arabian Peninsula. Theobroma cacao lives under the low, steamy canopy of the tropical Americas, its pale pulp hiding seeds that, once fermented and roasted, turn from harsh to transcendent. Cola nitida and Cola acuminata bear cola nuts that sit like small, bitter red almonds in African groves, chewed and traded for generations. Inside each of these plants sits a clan of alkaloids, caffeine, theobromine, and their close kin, that quietly push at hearts and minds, making heavy eyelids lighter, long watches bearable, conversations louder, work steadier. Humanity's first conversations with these species were neither instant nor global. They were hesitant, local, and intimate. In the highlands of what is now Ethiopia, herders and forest gatherers met a fruiting shrub with dark berries in a region later known as Kafaa, name that likely, and not accidentally, gave itself to coffee. The famous tale of Kaldi, the 9th century goatherd who noticed his animals bouncing around after eating bright red berries, and whose curiosity supposedly led monks to boil the beans to stay awake during prayer, is more parable than documentary. But it holds a useful kind of truth. It shows what discovery tends to look like: watch, test, then turn into ritual. By the late Middle Ages, modest coffee gardens and the skills of roasting and boiling the beans had taken root in the highlands of Yemen, where Sufi terraces embraced the stimulant for the long night vigils at the core of their practice. The earliest trustworthy written mentions of coffee surface in 15th century Yemeni and Mamluk sources, but the plant's pharmacology, its knack for sharpening attention and propping open eyelids, had already been tested and retested by chewers and drinkers over many lifetimes. The archaeological trail of caffeine and theobromine reads like a faint chemical whisper clinging to humble objects. In the tropical Americas, cups and jars hold residues that modern analysts can still detect centuries later. Traces of theobromine on carved vessels, crusts scraped from ceramic interiors once lined with sweetened foam and dried mud. Images that insist the cacao pod mattered deeply. The Maya and later the Mexica, Aztecs, left far more than chemical smudges. They left an entire system. Cacao seeds show up in murals and codices. They appear in the skeleton of trade and in the choreography of ritual. By the late pre-classic and classic periods, Roughly the first millennium BCE through the first millennium CE, the Maya were serving frothy spiced chocolate in ceremonial settings. Painted books show cacao trees beside high-status figures. The Aztec state took those practices and wove them directly into public finance. Cacao beans were tallied like currency in tribute lists and carefully drawn in the painted records of the Tenochtitlan court, later copied to paper in the Codex Mendoza around 1541 under Spanish oversight and shipped to Charles the Veuve. In those pages, compiled by people who had watched the bitter drink being used, cacao is not a private oddity. It is both money and status, medium of exchange and sign of rank. When Hernán Cortés landed at Veracruz in 1519, his men watched with equal embarrassment and fascination as what they later called chocolate was prepared and consumed in elite Aztec circles. Bernardino de Sahagun's Florentine Codex, compiled through the mid-1500s, set down recipes and rituals with the relentless patience of a friar ordered to inventory an entire belief system. Just as methodical were early human relationships with cola in West Africa and with tea in East Asia. Cola nuts bitter, chewed for a long time in the shade of village courtyards from what is now Nigeria through Ghana into Sierra Leone and the coastal forests, show up in 15th and 16th century European travel reports as prized objects of gift and ritual. Among Yoruba speakers, cola was offered at weddings and births, invoked in oaths. It functioned as a local currency. Trans-Saharan caravans hauling salt and gold across the desert toward coastal markets scooped up cola and pepper almost as an afterthought, the way a palm gathers crumbs, woven into the daily texture of trade that made kingdoms legible and payable. T. Camellia sinensis moves along its own parallel axis where myth and material evidence overlap. Chinese tradition keeps a gentle origin tale. The culture bringing sage Emperor Shennong sits beneath a tree. A leaf drifts into his hot water. He sips. It tastes good, and some of his ailments ease. It's a myth with a small, satisfied smile. What we can say without leaning on legend is still generous. Leaves and infusions were known to Chinese herbalists long before tea became the everyday drink of a vast empire. Tea shows up in medical treatises and in early mentions of healing brews. It appears again in monastery gardens, where Buddhist monks cultivated it to make night prayers less punishing. By the Tang dynasty, 618 to 907 CE, tea had slipped from being largely medicinal into something much closer to social and courtly custom. Then Lu Yu, a quiet scholar born in 733 and dead by 804, gathered and refined those practices into a slim, elegant volume, the Chajing the Classic of Tea. Lu Yu did more than list recipes. He laid down the craft of growing, processing, and savoring tea. How to choose water, how to pan roast, how to steam away doubt with the right boil. Under the Song dynasty, 960–1279, tea culture tightened into ritual and commerce at once. The powdered tea of Song elites was pounded, whisked and sipped in a social pattern that mirrored the disciplined rhythm of their bureaucratic lives. Across continents, humanity's first uses of caffeinated plants had the same basic outline. First sacred and medical, then domestic and social. A stimulant for the few that, in time, becomes a commodity for the many. Shamans and healers tried leaves and beans. Kings and priests adopted certain methods. Ordinary people copied what they saw and made it habit. The logistics of that habit mattered. Anything that could keep a watchman awake was strategically valuable. Monks used it for midnight services. Soldiers used it to keep marching. Officials used it to stay conscious over ledgers. Along the Himalayan corridors, Tibetan caravans packed dense tea bricks to trade for horses and salt tea as portable calories and stimulant, a manufactured good that could ride over mountain passes. In Africa, cola slotted neatly into networks linking towns to forests, turning social gifts into something you could carry the way cloth could not. In the Americas, cacao beans moved as both drink and money, tying agriculture to state formation from the start. To owe tribute in beans is to become a cog in a larger fiscal machine. Those early patterns kept repeating. Ritual made these plants respectable. Medicinal uses made them legitimate. Acquired taste made markets inevitable. People developed standard methods, 1 bud and 2 leaves, the drying that stops rot, the fermentation that locks in flavor. Scale demands that kind of repeatable technique. Once a process is standardized, it's ready to be scaled. Scale demands organization. Organization demands taxes, quotas, rules. If a plant makes whole populations more alert, the state eventually takes notice. So the story steps naturally into China, where tea became both a household comfort and a lever of governance. In the cool river valleys and misted terraces of Fujian, Jiangxi, and Yunnan, tea started as a garden plant, then became a village crop, and then an object of state attention. The first techniques were intimate: grafting, careful selection of tender shoots, the plucking rule of 1 bud and 2 leaves that still guides pickers in many gardens. But all those small decisions piled up into systems. Terraces were cut to tame erosion. Irrigation channels were redirected and maintained by community labor. Warehouses clustered by rivers and canals. Tea was dried and pressed into bricks for transport. The Grand Canal, a monument to imperial ambition, tying the Yangtze Basin to the Yellow River Plain, turned into a main artery for moving tea northward to the capitals. Tea flowed along rivers and mountain roads, bundled as tribute, punctuating the fiscal life of the empire from Tang through Song and later Ming. Lu Yu's charging was never just a tasting manual. It was an argument for order and aesthetic that quietly taught administration. Correct water, correct vessels, proper attention. In palaces and temples, tea rituals helped enforce a daily rhythm. Court officials, clerks, magistrates, the learned men training for the civil service exams all came to value wakefulness and moderation. That exam system, the core pathway for social mobility and bureaucratic staffing, rewarded long, grinding hours of study. Tea dissolved those hours into something survivable. Tea stalls and houses, first just tables where goods were sold, later as fixed urban institutions, offered places where political talk, literary critique, and neighborhood gossip could be traded over cups. In their severe way, they were nodes in a decentralized administration. Merchants, scribes, and low-level bureaucrats met there and left with more than warmed hands. The Song period accelerated tea as business and commercialized taste itself. Powdered tea, with its whisks and bowls, circulated among scholars who floated between salons and government posts. Beneath all that refinement sat hard practicalities. Tribute and tax lists for tea recorded quantities with exact measures. Officials were tasked with collecting and checking quality. Pack mules hauled bricks from Yunnan and Sichuan along the Tea Horse Road into Tibet in exchange for horses, binding distant regions into mutual dependence. The Tea Horse Road wasn't a dreamlike path. It was logistics: mule strings, caravanserai, negotiated tolls, military protection. The tribute system tied provinces to the capital with more than paperwork. It bound them with real fragile goods that demanded foresight and reliability. Technological change came as small, practical steps that reshaped social life. The Song habit of whisking powdered tea into froth required specific tools: stone mills to grind cakes, whisks to beat them into foam, bowls to receive the cloud. When the Ming Dynasty, founded in 1368, steered culture toward loose-leaf brewing, new ceramics became necessary. The teapot, small, lidded, perfect for infusion and preserving aroma, took center stage. Yixing clay pots and the later refinement of porcelain bowls were incremental upgrades that altered how people drank. Each object carried the logic of its method. Loose-leaf brewing encouraged small pours, multiple infusions, a pattern of shared sips. That pattern slotted neatly into a bureaucrat's workday: quick steeps between meetings, steady warmth through an afternoon over scrolls. Tea trade doubled as soft power. Tribute channels guaranteed supply for the court and simultaneously demanded loyalty. provinces elbowed for favor by presenting their finest leaves. The central bureaucracy, in turn, kept up the roads and waterways needed to move that tea. In the south, river ports and the Grand Canal became distribution hubs. The flow of tea inland and towards sea lanes knitted provincial economies into imperial purposes. Merchants specialized in certain regional teas. Longjing from the hills west of Hangzhou's West Lake, pan-fired flat leaves praised for their delicacy. Pu'er from Yunnan, pressed and aged. Tieguanyin from Fujian, carrying an oolong character. They built networks of buyers and brokers, the earliest outline of brands. When the state taxed these networks and set standards for tribute teas, it was governing through agriculture and taste. That doesn't mean tea only served to discipline, it also slackened the grind of daily life. Tea houses became spaces where scholars and townspeople argued poems, where merchants inked contracts, where urban culture got made. The relentless schedule of the exam's long sessions of memorization and commentary helped cement tea as habit. Literati drank as they annotated and drafted. Tea turned literacy from a purely solitary act into a shared craft. A tea bowl could be as much a companion as a brush. In a world where letters moved by horse and candlelight, tea was the fluid that kept hands writing. From Yunnan's peaks and Fujian's terraces, the stimulant story bends back to the Americas, where cacao had long been doing its own sacred and political work before Europe even glanced west. For those tending cacao, whether early domesticators in the upper Amazon or Mesoamerican masters who perfected fermentation and grinding, the bean was simultaneously sustenance, sacred object, and money. The Maya carried cacao into underworld myths and marriage rites. Classic Maya inscriptions show pods and priests pouring foamy chocolate at altars. The Aztec state in Tenochtitlan converted cacao into tribute. The Codex Mendoza and other picture manuscripts depict towns sending sacks of beans to the capital. Cacao was part of the running tally that held provinces in place. Its dual life as drink and as currency made it especially useful for a state trying to feed priesthoods and armies and also keep obligations countable. The chocolate of Mesoamerican courts was nothing like what Europeans would later crave. It was thick, often boosted with ground maize, sometimes laced with chili and blossoms, and always crowned with foam, the foam itself symbolic. The higher the froth, the higher the honor. That foam came from pouring between vessels, from vigorous beating with wooden sticks, from practiced gestures that shifted a mere calorie source into a statement about rank. Turning cacao into that drink required a long, careful chain of work. Harvesting pods, fermenting beans so the clinging pulp could transform into deeper flavors, drying in the sun, cracking shells, grinding into paste. Forest, household, and state were linked in those steps. When Europeans arrived, they stepped into this existing system and, like latecomers to any complex tradition, started tweaking. Cortés and his contingent found chocolate at the heart of Moctezuma II's courtly life. Moctezuma ruled from 1502 until the siege of 1520. Cortés is said, perhaps with some exaggeration, to have marveled at how much of the beverage the ruler drank from large bowls sometimes scented with vanilla or other perfumes. Spaniards noticed how thin the line was between what you sipped and what you spent. They also brought sugar, the ingredient that would remake chocolate in ways no one in Mesoamerica had asked for. Sugar plantations in the Caribbean and Brazil, built at a far darker, larger scale, created a sweetener supply unimaginable in the pre-Columbian world. Sugar's economic logic monoculture, export focus, plantation labor meshed perfectly with European craving for sweet luxury and flipped the bitter drink into a commodity. Spain served as the initial incubator for this transatlantic reinvention. In the first decades after conquest, chocolate crossed the ocean in a few chests and started as a court novelty. In the 16th and 17th centuries, the Spanish elite tinkered with recipes adding sugar, later milk, cinnamon, vanilla, even proto-cream, until the froth in a European cup bore almost no resemblance to an Aztec calabash full of ritual. chocolate houses and coffee houses would, together, become fashionable urban institutions in 17th century Europe. The change wasn't just about taste. Once sugar-heavy chocolate became a noble fashion, its demand powered plantations, shipping, insurance, credit webs, and an entire transatlantic logistics engine. That single cup of chocolate implied distances of fields, ports, colonial offices, and labor systems. This is the managerial reality hidden under a sweet surface. To make a commodity, you need scale. To scale production, you need organization. Reworking cacao also brought technological change. Grinding moved from stone metats in Mesoamerican kitchens to millstones, and then to mechanized rollers in European workshops. Texture shifted. Adding milk and, later, 19th century industrial inventions like conching and emulsification in Swiss and British factories transformed chocolate from drink to solid bar as well. But the most critical shift was cultural. A sacred liquid turned into a bourgeois treat, and then into an industrial product. That transformation from ritual object to supermarket item ran through many hands and systems. Taste shaped it, but prices, shipping routes, colonial farm policy, and merchant choices in Amsterdam and Seville organized it. Across all these converging paths, tea on Chinese terraces, coffee in Yemeni Sufi lodges and Ottoman bazaars, cacao in Maya and Aztec courts, cola beneath African canopies, you can feel the same structural beat. First, local insight. Someone notices a leaf, a seed, a bean, and what it can do. Second, ritual. Religious specialists build ceremonies around it, and by doing so, institutionalize its use. Third, economy. It becomes tradable, standardized, taxable, and experts emerge. Fourth, scale. Transport, storage, and administration adapt to move and control it in bulk. These cycles roll forward like a slow tide, barely visible day to day, sculpting a coastline of consumption that later centuries would mistake for the natural shape of the world. If we step back with a historian's calm and a storyteller's patience, the Forbidden Dispensary can show you why these plants matter far beyond the short-lived pleasure of a hot cup. They dissolved empires' problems and deepened people's bonds at the same time. Tea in China was as much a tool for structuring an administrative workday as it was a flavor. It financed offices and helped make the exam system survivable. Cacao became a minted unit in Aztec tribute, then a staple of Atlantic trade that reshaped soils and labor systems. Coffee, by making the late watch bearable, helped sustain literate cultures of argument in cities from Mecca and Istanbul to London, where the coffeehouse functioned as a public stage. Cola tied communities together and circulated as social currency in West Africa. Each plant's stimulant chemistry collided with social structures and with logistics canals, caravans, plantations, ports, mutating private cravings into public institutions. The first brews and first bites were small: an amused monk testing a leaf, a trader sampling a bean, a village festival raising a bitter cup. But those little moments launched trajectories that would cut the grooves of the modern world's tempo. The slow creation of processing techniques, of storage methods, of quality standards makes the early discoveries less romantic and more bureaucratic, and therefore more consequential. Fermented, sun-dried cacao in a Maya village becomes a line item in an Aztec tribute list. A few compressed tea bricks strapped to a mule in Yunnan become a horse at the far edge of Tibet. A salted tea ritual on a wind-blasted pass. A coffee bean roasted in Yemen and carried to Istanbul becomes a coffeehouse where talk plots and trade is spoken aloud. These are the dry logistics of habit picker schedules, drying patios, caravan timetables, dockside fees, customs clerks, and the simple math of scarcity and demand that slowly stack into empire. And then there's the irony. These plants kept people awake, which kept empires from dozing in their chairs. They made bureaucracies sharper and coffeehouses more dangerous. They were sacraments and tax bases. They offered a sweetness paid for by sugar grown under conditions that never show up on a dessert menu. So the story of caffeine-bearing plants is not just botanical, It is political, economic, and deeply personal. It's about how the chemistry sealed in a seed met the finances of states, how taste got standardized, how ritual trained people to spend money on pleasure. The tale unrolls across centuries. A small red berry in Ethiopian brush, green leaves pinched from a Chinese bush, bitter white seeds domesticated under an Amazon canopy, a cola nut broken and shared under a West African tree. Each encounter folded into a human pattern, ritual first, then trade. A flavor becomes a habit becomes a market redraws a map. That is the long anatomy of how ordinary people's experiments in kitchens and shrines turned into the engines of modern fiscal and social life. The first brews were never just drinks. They were trials that demanded systems. Those systems echoed outward until the whole world tasted faintly of wakefulness. In the high, cool folds of Ethiopia's plateaus, where clouds trail like slow wool and the ground hoards rain like a secret, small trees bore red cherries that would eventually jolt the world awake. There's a tidy little story too perfect to be fully trusted, too persistent to fade about a goat herd named Koldi, sometime in the first millennium, noticing his flock dancing with unusual energy after nibbling those cherries. He tries them. The goats leap, he brightens, and the fruit begins its long job of rearranging human habits. That neat fable has the right emotional temperature. The real course of events is longer, oilier, threaded with trade routes and monastic needs, grounded in communities and customs rather than a single aha moment. Coffee, in its wild form, grew in the forests that cartographers would later mark as Kaffa and Abyssinia. People there were chewing the fruits and making simple steeps long before any harbor clerk logged a shipment. From those uplands, the plant moved along human pathways as people migrated, bartered, and preached. By the 15th century, coffee cultivation had been claimed, shaped, and intensified in the mountains of Yemen, where climate and terraced slopes welcomed this Afro-Asian transplant. In the valleys above the Red Sea, around places like Sana'a, and on the ledges of Hadramaut, coffee shifted from something gathered to something planted, a crop rather than an occasional forest prize. The port of Al-Moka on Yemen's coast became the outward face of this internal economy, its name stitched into coffee itself. Yemen didn't scatter seeds abroad the way later colonial empires would fling plants across the globe. It guarded them, building a kind of monopoly on both the export of beans and the mystique of the roast, for as long as fortune and sea power allowed. Coffee's hard usefulness found a natural home in Islamic devotional culture. Sufi orders, the mystical, night-leaning currents in Islam, given over to long vigils, dhikr, and trance-like remembrance needed stamina. Their aesthetics were already tuned toward wakefulness and concentration. The dark infusion from roasted ground beans made those vigils easier, sharpened focus for long recitations, and kept singers and preachers upright through the night. Sufi lodges prized the new drink for exactly the same reason a modern serious reader might quietly bless a mug of coffee. It keeps the eyes clear enough for text and the mind swift enough for poetry and commentary. The earliest written mentions of coffee as a beverage come from this world. Sober lines in travelogues and merchant notes about night-drinking devotees and the conversations sparking around them. From Yemen's terraces, coffee moved into the great cities of the Ottoman orbit, by way of ships, roads, and rituals. Pilgrims and traders carried beans to Mecca and Medina, to Cairo, and eventually to Constantinople, after the Ottomans absorbed Mamluk territories in 1517. Ports and pilgrimage routes were the arteries along which this stimulant ran. By the mid-16th century, possibly even by the 1550s, the first Ottoman coffeehouses, kahvehane, were opening in Istanbul. They clustered near mosques, bazaars, and caravanserais, their metal pots hissing like tiny machines. Men sat on low platforms or wooden benches. The air was brown with steam and smoke, thick with roast boiling water and the worn leather of cushions. Small cups were filled with a dark, concentrated brew, and the vapor moved stories as fast as street criers moved broadsheets. These coffeehouses rewired social architecture. They weren't taverns in the European sense, no focus on alcohol, and they weren't just extensions of the market. They were new kinds of public rooms, open to men from different trades, relatively inexpensive compared to elite halls of patronage. Lawyers sat near artisans. Poets shared space with tax clerks. They became spots where someone might hear the day's news read aloud, where storytellers, medars performed, where shadow plays like Karagoz and Hativat pulled private satire onto a public screen. Musicians drew out the ney's long notes. Poets recited and were paid in coins and applause. Tavla backgammon rattled. Chess and gambling games unfolded. Deals were hammered out at volume, then sealed with a swallow of bitter coffee, sometimes sweetened with a bit of date sugar or honey. Fortune tellers stared into the grounds at the bottom of a cup, while men argued taxes, grain supplies, and the latest imperial decree. These coffeehouses had two faces. On one side, they were lively creative centers for music, informal legal advice, commerce, and gossip. On the other, they were channels through which rumor and political talk flowed, which made them objects of suspicion. Ottoman officials and the Sultan himself treated them as both necessary to urban order and inherently risky. The office of the Shaykhul Islam, the chief jurist of the empire, periodically issued fatwas about coffee as opinions swung between calling it harmless and classing it as intoxicating or morally corrupting, depending as much on politics as on doctrine. Sultans could be theatrical in response. Murad IV, ruling from 1623 to 1640, is remembered for cracking down hard on public vices. He allegedly rode the city in armor, enforcing bans on tobacco and coffeehouses, even ordering executions to show that he intended to discipline public life by force. The bans tended to be temporary and never total. The state learned to live with these rooms that functioned as quasi-official news feeds and civil registries, even as it planted informants and note-takers to keep an ear on the street. Coffeehouses were more than dens of entertainment or dissent. They were civic hardware before the modern state had language for that. They were nodes in webs of trust and information. A merchant could check the latest price on spices or silk. A sailor might find a captain looking for crew. These were places where an urban, masculine civic identity got practiced, where men learned how to argue in public, to listen, to repeat, to challenge. By the late 17th century, travelers like Evliya Çelebi, who roamed the Ottoman world taking notes over a lifetime, wrote about coffeehouses with keen attention, counting them, describing their music, marking their importance in city life. He didn't treat them as oddities, he recognized them as organs in the urban body. From Ottoman minarets, the taste moved into Italian ports and the mouths of European merchants seasoned by years in Levantine harbors. Europeans encountered this black drink and found in it a respectable alternative to morning ale and all-day alcohol. Venice, with its trade ties to Constantinople, served as one of Europe's first receivers of coffee. Italy's distinct coffee culture, espresso and fast ritual would come later, but coffee was already slipping into European imagination. London's first recorded coffeehouse appeared in 1652, opened by Pasqua Rosé, likely a Greek or Levantine who'd worked in Smyrna, set up in St. Michael's Alley off Cornhill, with backing from an English merchant who'd met coffee in the Eastern Mediterranean. London adopted the drink with gusto. Coffeehouses sprang up across the city like deliberately planted fungi. In London and across Europe, coffeehouses did several jobs at once. They were reading rooms where the new print culture, the daily paper, pamphlets, broadsides that could sink or float reputations, was passed around, often read aloud. One purchased copy might fuel hours of public listening. News moved from eye to tongue to ear. They were forums for negotiation, where deals could be discussed with a cup in hand, where a merchant could find a broker, and a broker might find a shipowner needing insurance. Some coffeehouses developed specialties. The Grecian, near St. Paul's, drew scholars and writers. Jonathan's in Change Alley became a magnet for stock jobbers and evolved into a seedbed for the London Stock Exchange. Lloyd's Coffee House, opened around 1688 by Edward Lloyd, became the place for maritime intelligence and risk-sharing shipping lists posted on walls. Losses and arrivals debated between sips. If coffee houses were the physical infrastructure for a new kind of public life, finance was the distinctly modern logic that fused with them. Information traded in the coffee house quickly became the currency that powered complex financial tools, insurance, speculation, futures. The ambience encouraged thought and exchange. Men read aloud from the latest Jeremiad or Gazette. They debated power, rights of parliament versus monarchy. Out of these arguments emerged the practices that historians later labeled the public sphere, spaces where opinion could form outside court and church control. A coffee house was a kind of proto-salon, but instead of the curated conversation of a Parisian drawing room run by a hostess, it was a loud mixed crowd of men, where the same idea might be rehearsed, altered and spread. Enlightenment thinking germinated in this soil. In Paris, Café Procope, opened in 1686 by Francesco Procopio dei Coltelli, an Italian who offered a more refined coffee, sweetened with sugar and softened with milk, became a regular haunt for Voltaire, Diderot, Rousseau, and others who translated skeptical philosophy into everyday language. Café de la Régence turned chessboards into stages for politics and thought, the pieces themselves carrying talk between tables. London's coffee houses leaned more commercial, but were no less intellectual. They hosted pamphleteers, satirists, and the men who would mint the words nations later used to argue about themselves. Tea slipped quietly into that same crucible and was absorbed into British life faster than many on the continent expected. The British East India Company drove the shift, importing huge volumes of Chinese tea from Canton in the late 17th and 18th centuries, and turning what had been a pricey curiosity into a national habit. Tea's domestic choreography, china cups and saucers, set times in the day, the family gathered, helped cement a sense of British identity around a beverage. Men might take coffee in public arenas of thought. Women, especially in the early phases, more often hosted tea in the home. Later, public tea rooms drew their own mix. Tea time, afternoon tea. These became as much part of British self-image as law or church. Crucially, the British wanted their tea sweet. From a sensory standpoint, caffeine and sugar bonded almost instantly. Tea, coffee, chocolate, all of them turned more palatable to European taste when sweetened. Sugar, once an exotic medicinal oddity, became the necessary partner for all three, a culinary accomplice that trained palates towards sweetness as a marker of comfort and civility. This is where the story turns darker. The European lust for sugar rose at the same time as overseas expansion. Sugarcane is not the sort of plant tended by a few hands in a family plot. It demands plantation logic. Commercial sugar production in the Americas began under the Portuguese in Brazil in the 1500s, then exploded in the Caribbean under English, French, and Dutch colonists in the 1600s and 1700s. Barbados, settled by the English in the 1620s, shifted from tobacco to sugar with dizzying speed. That sugar revolution became a pattern. Land consolidated into big estates, heavy capital poured into grinding mills, engenhos in Brazil, with their massive wooden and stone machinery, and staggering numbers of enslaved Africans forced into the fields and boiling houses. Plantation logistics were brutal and disciplined, shaped by the same rational thinking behind shipping timetables and commodity markets. Sugar needed to be planted, cut, crushed, boiled. Boiling houses transformed cane juice into crystal sugar and molasses. Molasses fed distilleries. Rum from molasses became its own valuable export and even entered the trade for more enslaved people. The triangular trade, finished goods from Europe, enslaved humans from Africa, tropical commodities like sugar and coffee back to Europe, wasn't just a textbook illustration. It was a business model, hardened into charters for companies like the Royal African Company, founded 1672, operating under royal license for monopoly and profit. Colonial law wrapped itself around this economy. English planters in Barbados drafted the Barbados Slave Code in 1661, a bare, chilling legal frame that defined ownership, punishment, and status for enslaved Africans. Turning raw violence into procedure, France answered with the Code Noir in 1685, a royal edict meant to regulate slavery in French colonies, asserting state control not to humanize but to stabilize a property system. These weren't humanitarian moves. They were legal scaffolding to secure an economy built on forced labor. Ships, warehouses, auction yards, insurance contracts. These made it possible for planters to think of human beings as cargo to be priced, insured, and moved, just like barrels of rum. Scale matters. The transatlantic slave trade was not a handful of bad actors, but a system. Roughly 12 million Africans are estimated to have been forced onto ships across the Middle Passage, not counting the millions more conscripted into coerced labor in the Americas. Those numbers hardened sorrow into structural reality. Ports like Elmina, Cape Coast, and Gorée in West Africa became exits in an economy of bodies. New World plantations in places like Jamaica, Saint-Domingue, São Paulo, and Rio's hinterlands turned into societies where enslaved people outnumbered the free, and the cycle of life planting, harvest, cane cutting was paced by sugar prices in London or Bordeaux. Wealth streamed back to Europe. It financed townhouses, endowed universities, paid for paintings and luxuries, and underwrote the very coffeehouses where liberty and rights were debated. The irony isn't subtle. The man arguing natural rights over a cup of sweetened coffee was often sipping the product of plantations worked by people who had none. The financial machinery that kept this system running looks disturbingly modern. London insurance firms underwrote voyages. Investors bought shares. Banks extended credit to planters and traders who mortgaged their estates to expand mills or buy more enslaved workers. The same coffeehouses that circulated price news were where reputations for creditworthiness were whispered and tested. When markets turned like during the South Sea Bubble in 1720, those very houses of speculation became confessionals where men discovered their ruin and plotted their next move. Insurance and speculation sank into the bones of empire. One could insure cargo that included human beings, buy stakes in companies chartered to develop whole regions, and send sugar presses across oceans with the smoothness that now feels like early capitalism. The ecological cost arrived early and hard. Forested islands were cut for cane. Hillsides were cleared and then exhausted. Boiling houses devoured timber as fuel, leading to deforestation that left bare soil to wash into the sea during storms. Hurricanes, pests, plant diseases, they were existential threats. Planters responded with new ways of calculating risk, spreading investments across islands, buying insurance, lobbying governments for tariffs and naval protection. The sugar that sweetened a genteel English tea or a Parisian cup of chocolate was rooted in an arithmetic that measured mortality, stripped biodiversity, and impoverished soils over the long term. Political consequences were inevitable. Duties on sugar and molasses became pressure points in imperial politics. The British Molasses Act of 1733, which tried to steer colonial trade by taxing molasses from non-British colonies, hurt New England rum distillers who relied on cheaper French and Dutch molasses. Smuggling transformed from vice to survival tactic. Later, when Parliament taxed tea through the Tea Act, and colonists responded with the Boston Tea Party in 1773, dumping chests of taxed tea into the harbor, they made it clear how central these caffeinated and sugared commodities had become to identity and political economy. The Atlantic world also erupted in resistance scaled to the violence of exploitation. Enslaved people revolted repeatedly, not as isolated outbursts, but as structural responses to an economy that treated them as interchangeable units. The Stono Rebellion in South Carolina in 1739, multiple uprisings in Jamaica, such as Tacky's War in 1760, and, most dramatically, the Revolution in Saint-Domingue, beginning in 1791, all challenged plantation order. Saint-Domingue, then a French colony, had become one of the planet's richest territories, shipping astonishing amounts of sugar and coffee to Europe. The Haitian Revolution demolished that wealth, but not before exposing the core contradiction of an Enlightenment world that spoke of universal rights and used enslaved labor to supply its cups. The irony sharpened. Language of freedom, often crafted in sugar-sweetened coffeehouses, collided with the bloody arithmetic of Caribbean plantations. Cultural practices shifted alongside. Chocolate, once exclusively a Mesoamerican ritual drink, became, in European hands, a sweetened luxury, then a common treat. Coffee's taste bent to local habits. Small, bitter cups in Ottoman lands, sweeter, milkier brews in British and French cities. European and colonial kitchens became maps of global flows. Sugar that once graced royal feasts now sweetened a child's drink or a soldier's ration. By the 1700s, what had been elite indulgence had become mass routine. Tea in British homes, coffee in offices and counting houses, sugar scattered across the menu. For better or worse, the stimulant economy sewed together European capitals and colonial plantations so tightly that social, economic, and political life fused. In that sense, the modern world was indeed partly forged by this odd alchemy. A small plant once chewed by herders became a grain of habit that traveled deserts and seas into lodges, coffeehouses, and account books. Sufi mystics seeking longer vigils shaped early coffee usage. Ottoman Caffeine structured public life from Bursa to Salonika. Venetian merchants carried the flavor into Europe. Coffeehouses in London and Paris provided scaffolding for an Enlightenment built on pamphlets and wages. Tea trade and sugar demand blessed a plantation system that rode on the forced movement and labor of millions. In the clink of a cup and the crinkle of a sheet of paper, you can still hear faint echoes of sugar-loaded hulls creaking in harbor, of boiling houses hissing, of contracts signed and human beings priced and shipped. It's not pleasant to dwell on, and the Forbidden Dispensary isn't here to dodge that discomfort. It's impossible to explain how a small stimulant molecule gained such geopolitical weight without tracing that line. There's a dark smirk in the background if you tilt your head. Societies lecturing about sobriety and rationality, talking high ideals about rights in rooms where every cup was sweetened by sugar grown by people denied any rights. Men theorizing property while owning people. Philosophies of freedom heated by drinks produced by chains. It's a bitter seasoning on the tongue of history. Yet there's a quieter truth in parallel. Those same coffeehouses and cafes incubated new forms of civic life. They normalized information exchange as a social good. They built habits of listening, public argument, and circulating print outside court patronage. The spread of printing, the move to market-based finance, the role of ideas that would inspire reform and revolution, all those have roots in the simple act of gathering in a room with hot cups. But the cultivation that made those cups sweet sugar plantations redrew maps of labor, species, land, sea, and even moral imagination. To follow caffeine from its wild home in Ethiopian forests, through Sufi nights and Ottoman caravans, into Venetian docks and London alleys, then into Parisian salons and Caribbean plantations, is to trace an intimate global history. It's a story about how bodies, land, and capital metabolized one another. It's the history of taste as engine of empires. The history of how a modest bioactive molecule ended up sitting at the center of social schedules, and then, linked to sugar, shipping, slavery, became both lever of profit and agent of ruin. We drink and read. We speculate and legislate. We stay sharp and we are cruel. The cups tell us as much. They keep the night, they keep the debate, they keep the ledger. And, like any honest pleasure cradled in the quiet before sleep, they hold both a beginning and a wakeful ending. The next turn of this story, the way coffeehouses and tea tables in Europe fostered print and financial markets, how stock trading and insurance grew from casual chat into formal exchanges, and how sugar's pull powered a transoceanic bondage industry, unfolded slowly, then violently, in the 17th and 18th centuries. Reading rooms in London and Paris doubled as training grounds for modern civic habits, exchanging information, forming public opinion, building networks that we now call civil society. Paper and roast, press and percolator, ledger and cup. Each pushed the other, each depended on the other. The stimulant and the sweetener, the quickened mind and the plantations extraction fused into one architecture of modernity. When you sit in a quiet cafe somewhere calm, fingers around a warm cup and a book or phone in front of you, it's easy to imagine the drink as a simple delight. But if you listen closely, you can still catch the old trade winds, hear the groan of a sugar-stuffed ship at anchor, the clatter of a press, the laughter in a room where freedom is debated between sips. That history moves to the beat of wind and heart, and that rhythm has a price. It also, whether we like it or not, built the modern world the Forbidden Dispensary is talking to you from now. Caffeinated, literate, argumentative, taxable, insured, and sweetened all at once. The coffee plant slipped out of Yemen like a figure leaving a dim monastery, carrying in its glossy cherries a charge that would redraw coastlines and state budgets, refit fields and factories. By the late 17th century, that restless shrub, Coffea arabica, had been carefully removed from the guarded mountain gardens of Mocha and Aden and placed aboard European ships, not just for taste, but for empire. The Dutch East India Company, VOC, one of the great administrative monsters of its age, with ledgers and charts stretching from the Low Countries to the Spice Archipelagos, was first to turn coffee into a truly global commodity. Around 1616, merchants and botanists in Amsterdam coaxed live plants into greenhouse beds. By mid-century, seedlings had been ferried to Batavia and into Java's wet volcanic soil. There, under Dutch colonial rule, coffee stopped being a curious import and solidified into a strategy of extraction. It became something to multiply, regiment, and send back to Europe measured in tons. Java, originally just the island's name, became shorthand for a kind of coffee and for one of the earliest, most thorough transformations from botanical curiosity to export machine. The VOC staked out plantations and leaned on a mix of labor systems. Over time, this hardened into what would be known as the cultua stelsel, the cultivation system formalized in the 1830s under Dutch administrators. Villages in Java were compelled to dedicate land and labor to coffee and other cash crops for sale on European markets. It was not delicate. It rewrote obligations and calendars, swapping out subsistence rice paddies for coffee rows and replacing diverse local crops with export monoculture. That pattern would echo, under different flags and names, across the global coffee belt. If the Dutch spirited coffee east, the French and Portuguese drove it into the Caribbean and Brazil. The 18th century became an age of botanical smuggling and diplomatic sleight of hand. Pierre Poivre A, French colonial official and part-time agricultural pirate, became famous for moving spice and coffee plants out of Dutch-controlled ports in the 1760s and establishing them on Île Bourbon, today Réunion, and Mauritius. French planters in Saint-Domingue, modern Haiti, had, by the late 1700s, locked the colony's prosperity to vast coffee estates run on enslaved labor. The island supplied a huge share of Europe's coffee until 1791. Then came the Haitian Revolution, violent, decisive, and world-shifting, shattering that plantation order and flinging planters, capital, and know-how around the Caribbean and into Cuba, where coffee continued under Spanish rule. Brazil's trajectory was different, and by the 19th century, it had become the engine room of world coffee. A half-legendary tale credits Francisco de Melo Palheta with sneaking seedlings into Pará in 1727. Whatever the precise path, the crucial change came later, when planters in São Paulo and other coastal provinces recognized how perfectly their interior plateaus suited coffee. Cheap labor first enslaved Africans, then waves of immigrants from Italy, Portugal, Japan, and elsewhere, combined with expanding rail lines to open interior lands. By the mid-1800s, Brazil was growing more than half the planet's coffee. The crop built fortunes and set politics. Café comme lait, coffee with milk, was more than a breakfast. It described the old republic's power pact between São Paulo's coffee elite and Minas Gerais' cattle and dairy interests, a living example of how one export commodity could become the pivot for a nation's governance. Railroads to move coffee to ports were funded by coffee wealth. Banks fattened on its trade. The bean turned into a national weight. A twitch in London or New York markets registered as a quake in Rio or São Paulo. On the African continent, Portuguese, British, and other European powers carved out their own coffee landscapes. Ethiopia, the ancestral home of Arabica, contributed the mythic origin story and vast genetic diversity. But much later, African production emerged mostly under colonial regimes that reorganized land and forced labor. In British East Africa, especially Kenya, the fertile highlands were cut into settler estates. European farmers, encouraged and shielded by colonial land laws that pushed Africans off prime soil, established coffee farms from the early 1900s on. Elsewhere, even without large settler populations, colonial governments pushed cash crops through taxes, forced labor, and agricultural departments that advised or coerced locals into new cropping models. Belgian Congo, Portuguese Angola, and Mozambique, French West Africa, all felt some version of these pressures, each context different, but all nudged toward aligning local ecologies with European taste and profit. The result was a patchwork of big estates and smallholder plots. But almost everywhere, market logic favored export monoculture. Monoculture sounds clean, it's really brittle. Fields planted wall to wall in a single species are easier to count, tax, and trade. They're also far more vulnerable. Coffee leaf rust Hemileia vastatrix is one of those tiny organisms whose story is far bigger than it looks. Appearing in the mid-19th century, rust swept through plantations like an invisible wildfire. Ceylon, Sri Lanka today, was hit catastrophically around 1869. Coffee had been planted there in dense, continuous stands. When rust arrived, the leaves yellowed, crops crashed, and planters had to pivot or quit. James Taylor and others moved enormous acreage from coffee to tea, and the British colonial economy adjusted. Tea became the island's new backbone. Rust didn't just swap crops, it swapped fortunes and reminded planters and governments alike that global commodity chains are not unstoppable. They're fragile, vulnerable to small fungi and shifting tastes. Labor on coffee was drilled into the rhythm of that fragility. In the Americas and Caribbean, coffee plantations often relied on slavery-enslaved Africans, built and worked estates in Brazil, Cuba, Haiti, Trinidad. Emancipation didn't remove coercion, it changed its costume. Terrified of labor shortages and rising costs, planters turned to new systems of migration and indenture. The British moved hundreds of thousands of Indian laborers to the Caribbean and Mauritius from the 1830s onward under contracts that often resembled bonded labor more than freedom. In Brazil, slavery's abolition in 1888 was followed by huge immigration schemes that brought Europeans and later Japanese into coffee regions, altering the racial and cultural mix, but not always the power imbalance. In East Africa, forced labor, tax policies designed to push people into cash work, and land seizures drove local populations into wage work on European estates or into migrant streams flowing toward cities and mines. Moving coffee from farm to cup also depended on heavy infrastructure. Coffee traveled in sacks, on ships designed to squeeze every kilo into hold space and shorten voyage times. British and Dutch merchant fleets, and then late 19th and early 20th century steam lines, tied plantations in Brazil, Colombia, Java, and East Africa to consumers in Europe and North America. Ports, docks, warehouses, sometimes cooled storage, all had to be built by colonial states or private capital. Commodity brokers tracked prices and speculated on futures. The New York Coffee Exchange and London's markets set benchmarks that rippled back to farmers who had almost no control over them. Exchange rates, tariffs, freight costs, any one of these could make an entire year's work worthless. So could drought or rust. Volatile prices created volatile politics. 19th century coffee booms generated huge wealth alongside deep fragility. Brazil's dependence on coffee made state policy hinge on valorization programs, government purchases and stockpiles, sometimes even destruction of surplus beans to hold up prices. In Central America and Colombia, coffee barons wrote themselves into constitutions, steered administrations, and shaped laws about land, labor, and infrastructure. In Guatemala, late 19th century liberal reforms under leaders like Justo Rufino Barrios shoved communal lands into private hands, often by force, to create a coffee elite locked into export markets. The downstream effects: land concentration, ecological change, class stratification, followed the neat rows of coffee trees. Producer societies weren't passive victims of all this. They adapted and, in some cases, prospered. Smallholder agriculture, especially in the 20th century in places like Kenya and Colombia, offered a different model. Scattered growers selling to co-ops or state boards could reclaim some leverage. Costa Rican coffee farmers shaped a relatively cohesive agrarian middle class that invested coffee money into schools, roads, and public institutions. In other regions, coffee profits hardened inequality and choked reform. Elsewhere, growers diversified into other crops or into processing and specialty niches with higher margins. The spread of coffee cultivation reshaped land, labor, and the definition of a real economy. It's a story of plant migration and bureaucratic design, of ships and agents, leaf diseases and tariff battles, but also of people in fields, harvesting at just right ripeness, spreading beans on patios to dry under sun. Coffee didn't just fuel faraway cravings. It carved new geographies of labor and capital geographies later sold back to the world in thousands of paper cups. As those commodity chains hardened, scientists far from plantations started asking what actually happened inside the body when people drank from those cups. The 19th century brought professional chemistry, and with it an intense curiosity about active principles in familiar plants. In 1819, Friedlieb Ferdinand Runge, a German chemist nudged by Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, isolated a bitter crystalline compound from coffee beans and named it Kaffeebas, soon caffeine. With that, Europe had its first clear chemical account of what it had been sipping for centuries: one small molecule with massive behavioral and economic effects. The term evolved caffeine, and the chemistry gradually caught up. Later in the century, other investigators, including Ludwig Ossian and Alonso Derivatives, refined extraction techniques, measured properties, and began to map the compound family. Caffeine turned out to be a trimethylxanthine 1 of several xanthine derivatives scattered through different plants. Structural work and synthesis ramped up near the century's end and into the early 1900s. Emil Fischer, a central figure in organic chemistry, untangled the structures of purines and xanthines. By the 1890s, workable synthetic routes to caffeine had been developed. That synthetic capacity mattered beyond pure science. It meant caffeine could be manufactured at scale, dosed accurately, and sold independent of harvest swings. Caffeine moved from mysterious plant essence to measurable chemical commodity. Understanding how caffeine worked in the brain took much longer. For decades, it was described mainly through behavior: stimulant, diuretic, appetite suppressant. The language of receptors and neurotransmitters didn't exist yet. Mid-20th century physiology started to lock down mechanisms. Researchers documented caffeine's effects on sleep, mood, and response thresholds. The key insight, arriving bit by bit across the mid and late 1900s, was that caffeine acts primarily as an antagonist at adenosine receptors. Adenosine, a neuromodulator, builds up during waking hours, soaking the brain in a signal that promotes sleepiness and pulls down arousal. Caffeine binds to those same receptors, A1, A2A, and others, without turning them on, blocking adenosine's drowsy message. The brakes loosen, neurons fire more freely, dopamine circuits gain relative prominence, reaction time improves, and people feel more awake. Nailing down receptor pharmacology took most of the 20th century. research into purinergic signaling. Jeffrey Bernstock and others in the 1970s reframed ATP and adenosine as real signaling molecules, not just metabolic byproducts. The next decades saw adenosine receptors cloned and characterized at the molecular level. Modern pharmacology finally gave caffeine a precise description: a competitive antagonist at adenosine receptors with a half-life that varies by species and by human genetics, often in the 4 to 6 hour range in adults, longer in newborns, shorter in heavy smokers. Those receptors connect into broader systems: dopamine pathways tied to reward, cholinergic circuits tied to attention, and vascular smooth muscle that controls blood flow in the brain. These connections explain the nuances: why caffeine sharpens focus during low stimulation tasks, why it raises heart rate and urine output, why quitting suddenly, if you're a regular user, can trigger headaches and a grey cloud of fatigue and irritability. Tolerance and withdrawal are, at root, the brain adapting to that blockade. Chronic caffeine use prompts up regulation of adenosine receptors and changes downstream signaling. Habitual drinkers feel less dramatic lift from their morning dose than first-timers. When they stop abruptly, unopposed adenosine signaling kicks in. Vessels dilate, heads pound, energy tanks. The psychiatric DSM now includes caffeine withdrawal as a legitimate syndrome. Most people never see a diagnosis. They just learn to self-titrate. Enough coffee to function, not so much that hands shake. Reframing caffeine as a defined psychoactive drug had social fallout. If this wasn't just custom, but a molecule with quantifiable brain effects, then workplaces, regulators, and marketers could regulate and exploit it more consciously. Sports bodies wrestled with caffeine's performance-boosting power. The International Olympic Committee once tested for caffeine and enforced urinary limits. Until 2004, it hovered on banned substance lists, then was removed from outright prohibition and put on a monitoring list. The logic was practical. Caffeine can improve performance, but it's so widespread that banning it would essentially criminalize everyday behavior. Drug companies harnessed caffeine in painkillers and cold remedies. Aspirin or acetaminophen plus caffeine became standard for certain headaches, and post-operative pain. Caffeine constricts blood vessels in the brain and amplifies mild analgesics. Products like Anakin in the US, launched in the 1930s, sold that combo to a public hungry for relief and energy. Caffeine also entered neonatal medicine. Caffeine citrate became a frontline treatment for apnea of prematurity. Premature infants, whose respiratory control is immature, respond to caffeine's stimulatory effects on brainstem breathing centers. The CAPI trial, Caffeine for Apnea of Prematurity, with long-term data published in 2006 and after, found that caffeine therapy reduced bronchopulmonary dysplasia and improved short-term outcomes. Later follow-up hinted at neurodevelopmental benefits. Dosing there is precise down to milligrams, quite unlike a random mug. Once caffeine was pinned down as measurable, it also became a workplace tool. The modern industrial timetable, the chopped measured day of shifts and whistles, of rail schedules, factory sirens, and synchronized clocks that E.P. Thompson and others wrote about, didn't appear spontaneously. It was enforced into existence. Stimulant use fit neatly into that regime. A coffee at dawn and another mid-morning could stretch wakefulness, blunt hunger, and fit bodies more snugly to the clock. Employers noticed. In 19th century factories and mines, bosses learned that caffeinated workers could keep repetitive tasks going longer, with fewer slow stretches just after a communal brew. The coffee pot hot, strong, immediate, became a simple productivity tool. The coffee break, that small, institutionalized pause carved into the workday, is modern in form but ancient in spirit. Guilds and merchants had their drink pauses long before anyone labeled them. London's 17th century coffeehouses, like Lloyd's, already functioned as places where time and talk meshed with transactions. By the early 20th century, factories in Britain and the US were formalizing short intervals for hot drinks. A 10-minute stop, a stretch, a refill. The origin of the phrase coffee break is murky. Newspapers and trade magazines show it in circulation in the early 1900s as half joke, half practice. By mid-century, it was standard. During World War II, sugar and coffee rations were politically sensitive. Securing coffee became part of keeping labor morale high. In the post-war corporate universe, the coffee break matured into social structuring, the hinge in an office day that gave people regular punctuation. Breaks served discipline and solidarity at once. They were times foremen could check in on crews, managers could scan the mood, and workers could share gossip, grievances, and organizing plans. Labor unions fought over break length, timing, and access to facilities. Because fatigue shapes output and control over rest shapes power. A poorly handled coffee supply could become a symbolic insult. Class and gender made these rituals uneven. 19th century public coffeehouses were male-heavy, while women managed the teapot at home. But as bourgeois households shifted and more women entered paid clerical work in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the lines blurred. Office coffee became part of the toolkit for secretaries and typists as much as for managers. The 1920s and 30s saw the rise of instant coffee and soluble extracts aggressively marketed to homemakers and office staff. Advertising fused convenience with modernity. Working-class spaces leaned toward very strong black coffee fuel for long physical days, while desk-bound offices gradually veered toward lighter roasts, then status-laden espresso machines. On plantations, labor division was often gendered: men felling and digging, women picking, sorting, and drying. But coffee itself could cross those divides at day's end, in both laborers' quarters and planters' verandas. Access and identity tracked class. Many people in producing countries couldn't afford good coffee locally until late in the 20th century. Ironically, some of the richest coffee soils on Earth housed communities that lived on cheaper substitutes and saw export beans as rare treats, while those beans flowed steadily to Europe and North America. In consuming nations, coffee became a class marker. In the early 1900s, a working man's café coffee might be a daily routine. By the late 20th century, specialty coffee and elaborate brewing methods, single origin, pour-over, espresso culture became signs of cultural capital. The rise of shift work for 24-hour hospitals, factories, and logistics hubs made stimulant use more systematic. Night shift workers leaned on caffeine to avoid catastrophic errors. Militaries turned sometimes to stronger substances, amphetamines in wartime. But caffeine remained the mild, socially sanctioned baseline. Ford's famous 8-hour day in 1914 and similar industrial reforms didn't remove the need for alertness. They rearranged it. Whether in a switchboard room, on an assembly line, or at a typewriter, each environment carved its own caffeine rhythm. Some employers began providing coffee free as a benefit. Others sold it cheaply in canteens, trading pennies per cup for smoother output. By the late 1900s and early 2000s, coffee itself had been rebranded again. Chains like Starbucks, founded in Seattle in 1971, reshaped under Howard Schultz in the late 80s and 90s, spun coffee drinking into lifestyle and corporate culture. Offices adapted, installing espresso machines, single-serve pods, specialty beans as part of recruitment and retention strategies. Caffeine still served labor's functional needs, but now carried layers of identity and ritual that made a purely utilitarian reading impossible. A coffee break in a branded corner could be framed as self-care or micro-consumption of a particular aesthetic, as much as a boost. If coffee helped structure work, it also helped structure time itself. Dividing the day into blocks and breaks, with cups anchored at each fault line, became a material expression of discipline. Arriving in time to beat the line, timing tasks between refills, syncing shift changes with pot refills, all of this wove caffeine into the architecture of hours and calendars. The shrub shipped out of Yemen via 19th century imperial ventures, cultivated on seized land, shielded and traded by companies and states, later disassembled under the chemist's knife and the neuroscientist's receptor profile. became at once a botanical engine in colonial economies and a chemical actor in brains. It rearranged landscapes and workforces and made global time tick differently. The Forbidden Dispensary wants to leave this section with a simple sensory image: the smell of roasted coffee. It carries oil, sugar, carbon, aromatic compounds, but also a ghost of ships, rusting leaves, petri dishes and flasks, factory whistles, and late-night clocks. In that scent sits a history of gardens and labs, empires and supply chains, and the soft, persistent fact that when morning comes, someone, somewhere, will need another cup. The irony whispers quietly. A small molecule in a small bean bent the pace of continents, and everyone kept drinking to stay awake. The click of cups and the dampening of conversation were the first trading floors. In London and Constantinople, Venice and Amsterdam, people gathered not just to drink, but to step into a shared current of talk rumors, ship names, prices, the stray poem for the price of a mug. Coffeehouses were, at once, public living rooms and information engines, rooms where the going rate of pepper and the fate of a brig could be traded as easily as compliments. They smelled like roasted beans and ink, like wet wool and hand oil, like paper money changing hands alongside gossip. The social café turned into a commercial organ because information itself is a commodity, and the steady murmur of voices, if you listen closely, is a hidden ledger. In late 17th century London, where the air was murky and trade outpaced the state's ability to count ships, coffeehouses clustered near Change Alley and the Strand by the Royal Exchange lighthouses for anyone whose business was news. There were houses for lawyers, houses for writers, houses for cloth dealers, and houses for those who lived off moving goods. Underwriters, brokers, commodities traders. Jonathan's Coffee House, first opened in the 1650s and later a fixture in Change Alley, buzzed with men swapping the latest prices and prospects in shares. A few doors away, in a narrower, wood-paneled room with a modest counter, Edward Lloyd ran a coffee house whose reputation for reliable shipping lists made it the place to find who had sailed, who had sunk, and who had profited. By the 1690s, Lloyd's lists were being printed and sold, and the men reading them began underwriting risks, first informally across sticky tables, then formally on slips of paper. Marine insurance caught its first real breath in that environment. Underwriters signed their names under policy terms, an act as binding as a handshake, powered by the caffeine in their cups. The transformation from casual gathering to formal market was a matter of scale and friction. When a merchant in Bristol could, in a morning, learn from a coffeehouse clerk that bad weather had delayed a Lisbon wheat shipment in the Channel, he could rewrite contracts, hire another ship, or buy insurance acting on information that had cost him only the price of a drink. Modern markets, in the sense we recognize, need three things: a place to gather information, tools to exchange promises, and small enough units of those promises that strangers can trade them. Coffeehouses provided all three. They collected news. They hosted promises, insurance contracts, bills of exchange, often scribbled in the margins of printed sheets, and they were the physical space where someone might buy or sell a share in a future cargo or an emerging company. Institutions followed cups. Jonathan's produced brokers who obsessively tracked slips bearing the names and prices of ventures. John Castaigne, a broker in the late 1690s, is credited with posting one of the first regular lists of stock and commodity prices, a kind of early index. By the early 1700s, Change Alley had become a speculation hub. Talk around coffee cups fed trades, trades fed positions taken on rumor. The South Sea Company, chartered in 1711 to manage national debt and granted trading rights in South America, floated on waves of coffeehouse chatter into the mania of 1720. Men reading letters from Paris or dispatches from York over a morning mug took plunges on South Sea stock and watched prices rocket. The very social design that made for fast, broad circulation of legitimate news coffeehouses, printed sheets, pamphlets, also let rumor cascade into collective belief and belief into price action. When the bubble burst, panic swept the same rooms. Men were broken, reputations were scorched. Lloyd's Coffee House is the clearest shorthand for how a cafe can become an institution. Through the 1690s and 1700s, underwriters at Lloyd's signed policies as they sat beneath maps and ship paintings, teaspoons clinking. Over time, Lloyd's came to mean more than four walls. It meant a culture of underwriting, rules, a marketplace for risk, published rates, a shared understanding that a signature was as much a form of capital as cash. Before Lloyd's was a corporation, reputations traded there like currency reputations that would later be written into official rosters and legal frameworks. The shift from hearth custom to formal procedure is the slow craft of modern economics, and coffeehouses were one of its workbenches. They doubled as reading rooms. Early 18th century English periodicals like The Tatler and The Spectator, Richard Steele and Joseph Addison's work, were written with coffeehouse audiences in mind. People read them aloud there, argued over them there, used them to sharpen opinion into consensus and disagreement into rumor. Newspapers matured alongside cafe culture. A single printed sheet, read in a crowded room, could move the perceived value of a company or shape expectations about a cargo's arrival. The speed at which news passed through those spaces prefigured the speed later demanded of telegraphs and phones. Coffeehouses also fostered specialization. Certain houses became the default hub for specific trades. A house with many underwriters shared specialized insurance vocabulary and practices. A house full of stock dealers developed handwritten contracts and habits of rapid deal-making. From those microcultures came the idea that markets could be segmented and run under different rule sets. Across Europe, similar shapes emerged. Amsterdam, where the Dutch East India Company had issued tradable shares as early as 1602, and where a formal exchange already operated, saw coffeehouses knitting merchants into the city's financial core. In Paris, cafes became philosophical salons and later centers of political news, but money talk always filtered through. In every city, coffeehouses plugged human networks into imperial currents. The coffee itself, grown on plantations in Java, the Caribbean, Brazil, was a colonial commodity. Its trade required ships, insurers, credit, negotiators. The cup in front of a London broker or Parisian lawyer was a local node in a global mesh. It's fitting and a little absurd that the stimulant that heightened attention and accelerated thought also sped the birth of finance. Caffeine sharpened the senses of the same people who, with paper and words, invented modern credit systems. By the 19th century, exchanges had moved out of cramped rooms into purpose-built halls, and Jonathan's and Lloyd's had evolved into legally recognized, regulated entities. But the skeleton of those institutions still looked like the cafe. Noise, prices, paper, bodies, routine. The modern abstract market anonymous buyers, sliced and traded risk. Cross-border capital owes more than a little to the layout of the coffee table, the scribbled slip, the posted list. If the coffeehouse helped assemble the framework of modern finance, 20th century technology transformed caffeine into an industrial global mass commodity. Roasted smells left hearth kitchens and drifted into factories and canneries. Beans once brewed in ceramic pots by hand entered the domain of the spray dryer and instant granule. Satoru Kato, a Japanese chemist who moved to the US around 1900, is often credited with presenting a powdered, soluble coffee at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo in 1901. It wasn't yet the product that would conquer supermarkets, but it was a step toward that. The big move came when industrial processing met corporate incentive. Nestlé's Nescafé, launched in 1938 after years of research and partly in response to a Brazilian coffee glut, is the archetype. Spray drying and then freeze drying produced soluble coffee that could live on shelves, travel to war fronts, and sit ready on kitchen counters. During World War II, instant coffee became standard in rations and energy source and a morale tool for troops on all sides. Post-war convenience stayed appealing. Households adopted the habit of a quick spoonful and hot water, and multinationals worked to turn coffee into a standardized, branded cross-cultural good. In parallel, the American cola wave built. Coca-Cola, born in Atlanta in 1886, had, by Asa Candler's hand, turned into a national brand with protected syrup and a distinctive bottle. By early 20th century, colas were more than drinks, they were symbols. Their caffeine content, lower than later energy drinks but still meaningful, was pitched as an invigorating asset. Temperance movements and the US Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 forced tonic makers to abandon more dangerous additives, like cocaine, and lean harder on caffeine as their main psychoactive. Cola companies mastered branding, and the soda fountain emerged as a new kind of café chrome, marble and neon catering to youth and urban rhythm. Japan added its own dimension. Companies like UCC, Ueshima Coffee Company, industrialized canned coffee and deployed it through vending machines, feeding a commuting public that wanted speed and warmth. Introduced in the post-war decades and perfected by the 60s and 70s, canned coffee made caffeine as accessible as a coin and a button press. The drink no longer required a social setting. Machines served it to solitary commuters at any hour. Japan's model of convenience, tiny cans, vending ubiquity, commuter logic spread, licensed and mutated. Energy drinks, the most concentrated expression of this industrialization, arrived later in the 20th century but had roots in earlier tonics. In Japan, products like Lipovitan D appeared in the 1960s for overworked salarymen. Thailand offered Krating Daeng, Red Bull, in the 1970s as a trucker's tonic. In 1987, Dietrich Mateschitz rebranded that Thai formula for Europe, launching Red Bull. Red Bull and its peers, Monster, Rockstar, and countless others, created a new marketing language hooked to youth, risk, extreme sports, nightlife. They also recalibrated caffeine doses. A can of cola might hold 30 to 50 milligrams of caffeine. An energy drink could double or triple that, then stack sugar, guarana, taurine, B vitamins on top. The result was no longer just a refreshment, it was sold as performance hardware. Advertising strategies evolved accordingly. Where 18th century essayists wrote for coffeehouse readers, 20th and 21st century marketers targeted lifestyles. Morning belonged to breakfast blends. College campuses became battlefields for energy shots. Brands hired athletes, sponsored events, lit up billboards, slid cans into movies and games. They carved out niches. Light blends and decaf pitch to women, colorful sugary products aimed at teens, concentrated shots for night shift workers. Branding achieved what coffeehouses never did. It turned a stimulant into a portable identity badge. Convenience changed taste. Where old coffeehouses had been sites of slow sipping and conversation, industrial coffee turned the drink into a fast-moving commodity. Brewing skill moved from human hands into devices, percolators, drip machines, pods. Social ritual became optional. Palates drifted toward sweetness. Global diets shifted away from bitter tradition and toward sugar-dominated profiles. Cola's sweet, fizzy, caffeinated rush became an everyday indulgence for huge populations. The consequences for health and culture were mixed. Caffeinated drinks served as lube for long workdays, marks of youth culture, coping tools for students, nurses, drivers. Scale forced the state into the story, into regulation, labeling, and sometimes confrontation. By the mid to late 20th century, scientists were probing caffeine with more nuance. Moderate coffee drinkers often showed sharper reaction times, better mood, less fatigue. Athletes discovered small performance boosts. For a while, global sports regulators considered caffeine a doping substance. The IOC monitored it and at one point set urinary cutoffs that, if exceeded, could mean sanctions. The World Anti-Doping Agency kept caffeine on watch lists and, in 2004, stepped back from banning it outright, recognizing the practical impossibility of policing such a ubiquitous compound. Public health discussion broadened. Early studies raised alarms about heavy caffeine and heart risks, about prenatal caffeine and low birth weight. Media outlets leaned into these fears, but as larger, better controlled studies appeared, the picture complicated. For many adults, 2 to 4 cups of coffee a day looked not only harmless, but in some analyses, possibly protective, associated with lower all-cause mortality, lower risks for certain liver diseases, and a lower incidence of Parkinson's disease. Global health agencies, including the IARC, International Agency for Research on Cancer, revised their evaluations. Coffee, once suspected as carcinogenic, was recategorized in 2016 as not classifiable as a cancer cause, with notes about potential protective links for liver and uterine cancers. Regulators, though, remained on alert for concentrated caffeine products. Pure powdered caffeine and high-dose pills posed serious dangers. A teaspoon of powder can equal dozens of cups of coffee. In the early 2010s, a few widely reported deaths linked to powdered caffeine prompted regulatory warnings and voluntary withdrawals from major retailers. The incident was a miniature of a larger pattern: technology enabling potent products faster than legal systems can respond. Different states tested different responses. Some taxed sugary caffeinated drinks. Mexico's soda tax, 2014, Berkeley's earlier municipal tax, and Chile's aggressive labeling and advertising restrictions, 2016, reflect attempts to push back on sugar's role in obesity and diabetes, often via drinks that carry caffeine too. The European Union mandated clear labels for beverages with more than 150 mg of caffeine per litre, a blunt tool to make stimulant content visible. Meanwhile, agencies like the US FDA navigated a patchy regulatory landscape where some caffeinated items count as soft drinks, others as dietary supplements, others as drugs, each with different rules. Debates emerged around pregnancy and caffeine. Early data made doctors cautious, warning women to restrict intake. Later meta-analyses suggested that modest consumption, often defined roughly as 1 or 2 standard cups daily, was likely compatible with healthy pregnancy for many. Health messaging tried to capture nuance, but nuance doesn't headline well, and the public often ended up with stark, oversimplified messages. Energy drinks became flashpoints at schools and sports fields. Some countries limited sales to minors, others required warning labels. Industry groups promised voluntary restraint in marketing to children. Regulators used consumer protection laws to police false or exaggerated performance claims. Science itself became a contested field. Observational studies struggled with confounders. Heavy coffee drinkers might smoke more, or sleep less, or be stressed in other ways. Over decades, as better designs accumulated, some earlier scares faded, others narrowed to particular populations. Those with heart rhythm disorders, for example. There were moral panics, echoing older anti-coffee or anti-tea campaigns. In earlier centuries, coffee had been accused of undermining Christian virtue or fueling idleness. Later, new caffeinated products were blamed for unruly youth, poor grades, and health scares. Each time a stimulant spreads, deeper anxieties about work, youth, mortality, and control surface. The modern regulatory landscape is now a patchwork quilt. The FDA keeps a wary eye on caffeine as a food additive, but largely exempts traditional drinks within set limits. The EU enforces labeling, but leaves some policy to member states. Local governments experiment with taxes. International sports bodies set and revise thresholds. Threaded through all this is the same fact that started this story. Caffeine keeps people awake and focused. That makes it valuable to individuals, profitable to companies, and politically awkward for states trying to balance freedom and safety. Branding has kept pace. As public health campaigns target sugar, companies pivot to zero sugar, natural, clean, caffeinated products. Marketing tries to promise the lift without the guilt. Science traces a far more complicated reality, full of "it depends," while policymakers try not to stumble too far behind. Look at the arc, and 3 phases stand out. First, the coffeehouse era lowered information friction and birthed markets. Second, the industrial era standardized caffeine products and globalized consumption. Third, the regulatory era has tried, unevenly, to place guardrails around an old stimulant now amplified by chemistry, marketing, and scale. Running through all 3 is the same human urge: to be a little more awake, a little more focused, to find the edge needed to finish a letter, close a deal, pass an exam, endure a shift. Caffeine is, in essence, a technology of attention tiny everywhere. The Forbidden Dispensary wants to highlight how intimate the consequences are. The financial markets born in caffeinated rooms funded colonization, plantation economies, and war, then industry. Those same coffeehouses also nurtured talk about liberty and rights. Coffee, tea, and cocoa sit along a moral seam. They lubricate commerce and conversation, both exploited and emancipatory. Today, when someone grabs a branded paper cup on their way into a subway, they're walking through centuries of decisions, rituals of attention, products engineered in corporate labs, tastes shaped by sugar and advertising, behaviors tweaked by public health campaigns and scientific findings. Regulators, politicians, and scientists still wrestle with caffeine because it's both ordinary and potent, private and collective. Stories of underwriting desks and stock manias, of tin cans of instant, of neon energy drinks and court cases are all chapters in the same ongoing narrative. The drug that helped forge the modern world is still reshaping it. Picture a banker in 1720, cup of black coffee in hand, scanning a price sheet tacked to a wall at Jonathan's. Picture a modern barista tamping espresso while a line checks market apps on their phones. The noises, change quills, and murmurs give way to grinders and push notifications. The cup remains. The habit persists, so the contemporary argument about caffeine isn't just pharmacology. It's about where we draw lines around normal and risky, who profits from mass consumption, and how public institutions reconcile individual rituals with collective costs. It's about how a bitter little bean from highland shrubs seeded financial systems in cramped London rooms, how instant granules made mass mornings possible, and how a fluorescent can became both fuel and a public health worry. New studies will keep appearing, new products will keep launching, regulators will adjust, businesses will innovate both in evasion and compliance, and people will keep chasing that particular clarity caffeine offers. Sometimes in ancient ways, sometimes in forms no Sufi or Song dynasty scholar could have imagined. The history of caffeine is, in the end, a history of institutions and of people, the search for wakefulness, focus, company, and gain. That's one reason this tale keeps being told at the Forbidden Dispensary and in countless cafes, policy rooms, labs, and bedrooms. The story of a stimulant is a story of civilization itself, its craving for speed, its endurance, its appetite for calculated risk, and its small, dependable rituals that make work and conversation possible. Follow the long, slow drip from roaster to cup, and you're effectively tracing the history of the modern world. In rooms softened by tatami and the faint scrape of a bamboo whisk against powdered green, the story of taste has always been a quiet kind of politics. The Japanese tea ceremony, shanoyu, shows this with no disguise. It's a ritual sewn into posture and architecture. Refined by Sen-no Rikyu in the 16th century into a philosophy that turned the preparation of matcha into a discipline of the self. Rikyu's insistence on wabi-sabi, the beauty of austerity and imperfection, transformed a bowl of powdered leaf into a statement about social order and spiritual control. In a small Kyoto tea room, a samurai or merchant could make, in the bare space of a ladle and a bowl, a world of values. The ritual was never just flavor, it was a curriculum in etiquette and hierarchy. A choreography that taught you how to see and recognize another person across a low table. The tea bowl became an instrument for measuring social distance. Who drinks first, how a bowl is turned, where a guest sits, how fabrics are chosen. All these micro gestures told the room who you were. Tea became identity. Across centuries and oceans, other caffeinated drinks claimed similar ground in their own languages. Look at the espresso rituals of Naples. Concise, muscular. A fast pull at a standing bar, a quick un-café to the barista. A coin down, a swallow, then back into the street. That's not just caffeine intake, that's citizenship, that's Neapolitan. Italy's obsession with espresso. The machines that hiss in cafes from Turin to Trieste and into every town square grew into a democratic taste ritual. It's quick, public, often male-coded, and the opposite of the unhurried Viennese coffeehouse. The machine itself, a metal animal refined by tinkerers like Luigi Bezzera, Achille Gaggia, and Tuscan and Lombard manufacturers through the early 20th century, became part of the city's choreography. Ordering a ristretto in Naples is performing an identity rooted in mid-century machine shops, migration patterns, and urban sociability, compressed into a mouthful. Once tea, coffee, and chocolate step over the line from food into ceremony, they grow vocabularies. Words for aroma, for body, for finish. Those words become tools for organizing status. Victorian drawing rooms, where the Duchess of Bedford popularized afternoon tea in the 1840s, turned a private snack into a public script of class. Sitting down to tea in that world meant demonstrating that you could afford imported leaves, fine porcelain, sugar, and leisure. In contrast, the proletarian café of early 20th century Vienna, with its long marble tables and newspapers pinned to wooden holders, made the coffeehouse into a public study hall. Ideas fermented among smoke and cups. The ritual there was not about porcelain and lace. It was about time to read, to argue, to belong to a certain intellectual stratum. Taste rituals distribute prestige. Late 20th and early 21st century third-wave coffee rewrote those distributions again, sprouting in the 1990s and taking concrete form in roasteries and shops like Stumptown, Portland, Intelligentsia, Chicago, Counterculture, Blue Bottle, Oakland. This wave turned beans into objects of connoisseurship. The language was both breathless and meticulous. Single origin, micro lot, altitude, cultivar, process washed, natural, honey. These markers covered brown paper bags like heraldry. Baristas began talking like sommeliers. Customers listened as if tasting notes carried ethical meaning. Yirgacheffe became shorthand not just for a region in Ethiopia, but for jasmine aromatics. Sidamo suggested berries. The pour-over, with its ritual bloom, precise water temperature, and slow spiral pour, demanded patience and promised authenticity, or at least the performance of it. These practices mattered because they built new stories of provenance that tied an urban cafe in Brooklyn or Tokyo directly to a named farmer in Guatemala or a cooperative in Rwanda. Those stories did more than describe flavor. They created moral capital. If a roaster says, "We paid a living price, we know the farmer, we cupped these lots together at sunrise," they're offering you not just taste, but a way to feel like your consumption is virtuous. To drink third-wave coffee is to adopt a persona: informed, discerning, globally aware, vaguely activist, often young and urban, on the side of sustainability, at least in theory. Aesthetics reinforce these claims. Think of a Japanese chashitsu, low light on a kintsugi-repaired bowl, the aroma of whisked matcha settling into the silence. The ceremony is engineered to decelerate you until each sip becomes a kind of meditation. Now contrast that with a Scandinavian-inspired third-wave cafe. Bare wood, matte black gear, airy light, a single plant in the corner. The visual language says modern, minimal, controlled variables. It is clinical, almost lab-like, emphasizing clarity and transparency. In São Paulo, Cafezinho tiny cups of very sweet, very hot coffee binds public and private life with astonishing efficiency. In offices and living rooms alike, offering café is a reflex of hospitality. It's democratic and deeply local, a practiced courtesy that says, "I acknowledge you," carried by caffeine. A ritual's strength lies in repetition and in objects. The tamper, the portafilter, the hand-thrown bowl, the bamboo whisk, the tiny spoon of brown sugar tools train bodies. They teach what doing it right feels like, and in doing so, they teach who belongs. Behind those objects are narratives. A single origin Yirgacheffe or Huehuetenango is not neutral. It conjures altitude, heirloom varieties, traditional processing, and an implied intimacy between roaster and grower. Sometimes that intimacy is real, sometimes it's thin, but the narrative builds community. Producers form cooperatives to access specialty markets. Baristas form communities and compete. The World Barista Championship, launched in 2000, turns coffee into performance. Competitors must not only pull shots, but tell compelling stories about beans, farmers, and flavors. Consumers, in turn, sort themselves into taste tribes, signaled by the bags in their cupboards, the subscriptions they hold, the reusable cup they carry. Tokyo's kiss at an old-school coffeehouses were once dim, smoky refuges where older men lingered with newspapers and nurses took quiet breaks. Many now coexist with, or have morphed into, sleek modern cafes. Some embraced espresso and single-origin beans. Others guard the slow, theatrical siphon brew and worn counters, preserving a kind of time capsule in a city that pulses at neon speed. In São Paulo and Rio, cafes blend Italian espresso traditions from immigrant communities with Brazil's own cafezinho habit. The result is a hybrid ritual: quick counter shots at dawn, languid specialty brews with conversation at dusk. Same plant, many selves. Taste rituals draw class lines. In London's Shoreditch or Paris's 11th arrondissement, the clustering of specialty coffee bars often marks gentrifying territory. A la Marzocco machine in the window signals a neighborhood's new direction. Knowing how to pronounce Guji, the difference between an AeroPress and a Chemex, how to talk about body and clarity, these bits of knowledge turn into social signals, what Bourdieu would call cultural capital. Behind the lyricism of cups, however, sits a severe machine: logistics. Coffee, tea, and cacao have always required massive infrastructure. Shipping, warehousing, futures markets, processing, refrigeration. Those systems shape which rituals are even possible. The British Empire's ability to move tea from Assam and Ceylon to London parlours was not inevitable. It depended on shipbuilding, naval protection, canals, and coordinated bureaucracy. The same colonial pipelines that flooded Europe with tea also introduced standardized grades and blends that became class markers. Whoever controlled docks, charters, and plantations effectively controlled taste. Steamships and cold chains in the 19th century extended the reach of perishable goods, carrying fresh milk, citrus, and other ingredients that reshaped drinks and rituals. The rituals of taste, in other words, ride on steel, coal, and insurance policies as much as on clay and bamboo. When war comes, those dependencies turn acute. Soldiers need calories that travel, keep, and comfort. Caffeine answers all three. From the 19th century onward, military planners recognized that hot caffeinated drinks matter for both morale and performance. In the Royal Navy, tea became as institutional as the ship's bell. Rationed, brewed in bulk, logged. An alert crew is a better crew. By World War I, trench warfare on both sides included kettles and urns as part of basic kit. Tea or coffee weren't luxuries, they were tools to keep men lucid in cold mud. Industrialized war forced provisioning to become mathematical. Standardized rations, optimized weights, canned coffee, condensed milk, sugar, dry tea. These choices had civilian echoes. A soldier who survived on canned coffee at the front often came home wired to appreciate instant. Convenience learned under stress often becomes habit under peace. World War II intensified these currents and introduced technologies like mass-scale spray-dried coffee that would define peacetime shelves. Nescafé, already born as a solution to Brazilian overproduction, became a staple in US Army rations. Millions of soldiers formed emotional and sensory bonds with it. After 1945, supermarket aisles reinforced those bonds. Wartime also drove experiments with stimulants. Amphetamines saw widespread use in many armies, raising later ethical questions about coercion and long-term effects. Caffeine, comparatively mild and familiar, remained the acceptable baseline. Military labs studied it in depth, how it offset sleep deprivation, which delivery methods tablets, gum, drink worked fastest. What doses preserved performance without too many side effects? Products like caffeinated chewing gum emerged from that research, later deployed in conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan to keep drivers and pilots vigilant. The logistics of getting caffeine to soldiers, sourcing, shipping, storing it from farm to front line became part of national security planning. When blockades or occupation cut supply chains, armies scrambled for substitutes: chicory, roasted grains, ersatz coffee. Factories that scaled up to supply war retooled for peacetime markets, carrying instant coffee and industrial cocoa along with them. Military endorsement of a substance, as always, sends a powerful cultural signal. Ethical debates followed. Is it acceptable for institutions that already command people's bodies to add stimulants into the mix? Do soldiers truly consent in such hierarchies? Veterans' accounts suggest complex legacies: disrupted sleep, altered relationships with substances, lingering dependencies. The same military R&D that produced ration coffee and performance studies later fed into civilian energy drinks and pills. Corporate labs borrowed knowledge, added sugar and branding, and pushed new products into a marketplace wired for more output, less rest. If the recent past braided taste, identity, and military logistics, the near future threatens the agricultural base of these rituals altogether. The coffee belt, a band looping around the equator through Brazil, Vietnam, Ethiopia, Colombia, Honduras, Indonesia, is heating up. Arabica, the darling of specialty coffee, is picky. It likes narrow temperature bands, predictable rain, certain altitudes. Even modest warming pushes it toward stress. The 2012-2013 outbreak of coffee leaf rust across Central America was an early alarm. Farms in Costa Rica, Guatemala, Nicaragua watched their trees sicken and yields crash. Governments declared emergencies. Climate change alters disease patterns, pests, and rainfall. Many farmers have responded by planting more Robusta, Coffea canephora, hardier, higher yielding, but generally regarded as less refined in flavor. Robusta often ends up in instant blends, supermarket tins, and espresso crema boosters. Its adaptability makes it an insurance policy. Its reputation keeps prices lower. Breeding programs work furiously to close that gap. Colombia's research institute, Café, developed rust-resistant varieties like Castillo. Other countries experiment with F1 hybrids that combine Arabica's cup potential with Robusta's toughness. Shade-grown agroforestry systems, mixing coffee with fruit trees, canopy species, and ground cover can buffer microclimates, protect biodiversity, and sequester carbon. Institutions such as World Coffee Research, CGIAR centers, Brazil's Embrapa, and national agronomy labs coordinate breeding and extension work. Yet these fixes move slowly, while climatic shifts and global markets move fast. Uphill migration is an obvious adaptation in some places. Move coffee to higher elevations where it's cooler. But mountains have limits, people have land titles or don't, and forests stand in the way. Where land rights are weak or slopes already crowded, options narrow. All of this matters not just for taste, but for livelihoods. Tens of millions of smallholder households depend on coffee as their main cash crop. They face a double volatility, climate shock and price shock. Boom years and crash years make planning nearly impossible. When global prices slump, farmers can't afford new seedlings or shade trees. When disease hits, they may abandon coffee altogether or migrate. Technological innovation looks both promising and unsettling against this backdrop. Precision fermentation and cellular agriculture have entered the scene. Labs and startups talk openly about beanless coffee, recreating coffee flavor and aroma using fermented grains, synthetic flavor compounds, or engineered microbes. Synthetic caffeine already dominates pharmaceutical and soft drink markets. Extending that model to flavor, texture, and even functional molecules like antioxidants is a logical next step. From an environmental standpoint, lab-made coffee could shrink land use and pesticide loads. From a social standpoint, it could further divorce urban consumption from rural reality. Here's the cultural catch. Rituals lean on notions of origin and authenticity. Will a cup built in a bioreactor carry the same weight as one sourced from a hillside in Yirgachev? For some, maybe. For others, terroir and history are part of what they think they're sipping. Ethical frameworks are scrambling to meet this future. Fair trade, developed in the late 1980s under foundations like Max Havelaar, proposed a model where certified growers received minimum prices and community premiums. It helped some farmers, raised awareness, and built a retail niche. It also faced criticism, high certification costs, limited market share, and a tendency in some cases to function more as marketing than transformation. Direct trade, central to many third-wave roasters, sidesteps some of those issues by encouraging roasters to negotiate directly with growers, pay higher prices, and build long-term relationships. When it's done well, farmers benefit. But without independent oversight, outcomes depend entirely on buyer ethics and capacity. A newer buzzword is regenerative agriculture, not just minimizing harm, but actively healing soil, increasing biodiversity, and storing carbon. Shade trees, cover crops, composting, reduced chemical use. It's both an agronomic and moral pitch. Some roasters and brands now stress regenerative practices as part of their identity. Scaling regenerative systems requires funding, training, and market access. Governments and NGOs can help, but the demand side matters too. Consumers in wealthy economies have to be willing to pay more and demand credible proof. Traceability systems, sometimes using digital tools like blockchain, are being built to show not only where a lot was grown, but how. Policy is a necessary lever. Farmers need access to credit that allows them to plant new, more resilient varietals and invest in shade or irrigation. Cooperatives need legal recognition and technical support. Futures markets and stabilization schemes could be reimagined to buffer catastrophic price drops. Producing countries from Brazil to Ethiopia have to coordinate research, stewardship, and social safety nets. Consumers have power, but also limits. Not everyone can pay specialty prices. Not everyone cares to read every label. So there's a tension between building niche, ethical markets and transforming the core commodity system that dictates most farmers' fates. Culture will mediate what survives. Deeply rooted rituals, the Japanese tea ceremony, the Neapolitan espresso at the bar, Brazil's cafezinho for every guest will likely endure, even if ingredients shift, because they are about people as much as plants. These practices are sewn into language, humor, gestures, childhood memories. They're not easily replaced by powdered substitutes. Third-wave rituals, which lean heavily on micro-origin narratives, may have to evolve. They might double down on high-altitude refuges and ultra-premium lots. Or they might pivot, elevating resilience, regenerative practices, and even hybrid or lab-augmented coffees as new marks of connoisseurship. Labor sits at the center of all this. The cocoa sector in West Africa has faced repeated exposés about child labor and harsh conditions. Coffee regions have their own stories of underpayment, seasonal precarity, and landlessness. Certification and direct trade can improve incomes along certain chains. But deeper patterns, colonial land distribution, indebtedness, global price expectations are hard to untangle. Technological substitution could, in theory, relieve some labor burdens. It could also erase rural jobs without offering alternatives. A flavor industry concentrated in biotech clusters could end up capturing most of the value, while former farming communities slip further into poverty or are forced into precarious migration. An equitable future requires more than clever fermenters. It demands policy and law that ensure producing communities share in any gains. Revenue sharing agreements, benefit sharing on genetic resources, antitrust action against overly concentrated buyers, and support for local processing and value adding. There are brighter paths and darker ones, and they can unfold together. In one scenario, science and policy collaborate. Resilient plant lines spread, regenerative systems are widely adopted, premiums reach farmers, and rituals adapt without losing their soul. In another, climate and markets outpace reform, synthetic substitutes dominate, smallholders are pushed out, and traditional rituals become nostalgia performed for tourists. Choosing the first path means treating coffee, tea, and cacao as more than inputs to modern life. It means recognizing them as relationships with land, with history, with other people. A few principles can guide that effort. Subsidiarity. Let communities decide how to adapt, instead of imposing top-down blueprints. Transparency. Back ethical claims with verifiable data, not just pretty stories. Reciprocity. If consumers and companies in rich nations have benefited from centuries of cheap caffeine and sugar, they share responsibility for the costs, ecological and human. Technology won't sit quietly. Biotech can open elegant possibilities, from climate-proof varieties to low-impact flavor production. It can also centralize power if patents and capital concentrate. So law and politics have to keep pace. Intellectual property regimes that respect farmers and indigenous custodians of plant diversity. Trade rules that don't lock producers into low-value segments. Financial tools that distribute risk more fairly. The rituals of taste, what the Forbidden Dispensary keeps returning to, will be shaped by all of this. Whether they become more exclusive and nostalgic or more inclusive and just is not pre-written. Despite the scale of the challenge, there's a small, stubborn hope embedded in caffeine culture itself. People gather around it. Coffee and tea are excuses to pause and talk. The same networks that built third-wave scenes roasters, visiting farms, baristas swapping knowledge, consumers learning origins can be retooled to champion resilience and fairness, not just rarity and flavor. Imagine a future cup, a porcelain bowl repaired with gold seams. A barista who can tell you both the farm's name and the fermentation curve. A farmer who gets a predictable income and a voice in how beans are grown and sold. A roaster who is part owner of a cooperative, not just a bidder at a commodity auction. A city where cafes center community more than exclusivity. Imagine governments investing in rural roads and agronomy, companies licensing plant lines under terms that share value with origin countries, and consumers willing to pay not only for tasting notes, but for what those notes imply about labor and land. And yet, also imagine the quiet persistence of ritual. Somewhere in Kyoto, people will still gather at twilight to watch a whisk draw slow circles through powdered green, to feel the rough lip of a tea bowl, to let manners sculpt conversation. In Naples, someone will still order a café, stand at the bar, toss it back, and vanish into the alley. In São Paulo, a host will still insist on serving a cafezinho because hospitality runs deeper than efficiency. Rituals mutate and endure in unpredictable blends. They preserve and reinvent at once. If the modern world was largely forged in stimulant culture, the imperial voyages steered by tea, the factories synchronized by coffee breaks, the soldiers held together by instant sachets, then the next world will be forged through choices about care, fairness, and risk. The logistics machine that once pushed product outward will have to carry different freight, investments in soil, in communities, in knowledge and law. It will take funding, patience, and a shift from extraction toward stewardship, from maximum speed toward resilience. Underneath that, there's a simple human constant. Rituals are as much about how we treat one another as about what's in the cup. The matcha bowl, the espresso, the cafezinho. Each one is a small contract of recognition. They say, without words, "I see you." We're still going to need that contract. The real question is how we'll honor it when beans and leaves get scarcer or more expensive, when lab tanks can mimic flavors, and when the temptation to choose quick, cheap convenience is very strong. Will we let convenience and bioreactors define our caffeinated future alone? Or will we take the slower, harder path of sharing landscapes, labor and law more equitably? There's no clean answer. It will be messy, uneven, sometimes cruel, sometimes generous. But it will be human. Humans have always reshaped their rituals to fit their times. If there's any virtue in this long story, it's this. Taste alone won't save coffee, tea, or cacao. Only collective action will. The cup is a promise as much as a pleasure, promising warmth, focus, company. Keeping that promise for the tea room and the coffee bar, the soldier and the picker, the grandmother who insists on serving coffee with a smile will demand work at scales we rarely associate with simple joys. It will demand policy, science, redistribution, and a new kind of taste. A taste for justice. So as the kettle cools and cafe lights soften toward evening, think of your next cup as a hinge between inherited comforts and new obligations. Sip slowly, pay attention. Remember that the smallest gesture, a hand extending a cup, can be an act of solidarity. That might be caffeine's last hard lesson to the modern world, and the first one it needs to teach us as we walk into whatever comes next. The pleasures we inherit come with responsibilities. The Forbidden Dispensary will end where the cup begins, in that thin space between comfort and accountability. Every time a hand passes a porcelain bowl, a chipped mug, a paper cup, an unspoken contract flickers. Warmth for attention, flavor for time, stimulation for trust. If the long history of caffeine has shown us anything, it's that no pleasure is isolated. A leaf dropped in an emperor's bowl, a goatherd's curious bite, a Sufi's midnight vigil, a Maya priest pouring foam, a clerk in a London coffeehouse scanning a price list, a soldier warming his hands around a tin cup, a barista weighing out 18 grams of a single origin. All of them belong to the same unfolding story. It's a story of plants that speed the mind, of bodies that crave more waking hours, of empires that turned that craving into policy and profit, of revolutions planned over bitter cups, of plantations carved out of forests, of ships loaded with sugar and beans, of chemists isolating white crystals, of neuroscientists tracing receptor pathways, of advertisers bottling ambition in aluminum, of activists and farmers trying to bend the arc toward justice. Caffeine did not cause the modern world, but it tuned the tempo. It sharpened the meetings where laws were written, underpinned the workdays when factories roared to life, softened the edges of fatigue when books were read and manifestos drafted. It sat quietly in the center of our schedules. The Forbidden Dispensary isn't here to tell you to renounce your cup. We're here to suggest you see through it. See the terraces in Yunnan and the rust-stained leaves in Central America, the Javanese farmer under colonial quotas, the Haitian rebel in the cane field, the Ottoman storyteller at a carvahan, the clerk at Lloyd's scribbling under a ship's name, the assembly line worker on a 10-minute break, the graduate student at 2 a.m. with a stack of articles and a coffee ring on the desk. See also the barista today, talking origin and process, the farmer wondering whether the next harvest will make the loan payment, the regulator reading new health data, the marketer choosing between natural and zero sugar on a can, the teenager slamming an energy drink before a night shift because there's no other way to stay awake. This is what it means to say that caffeine helped forge the modern world. Its molecules sit at the crossroads where chemistry meets choice, where private rituals cross into public consequences. The final question the Forbidden Dispensary leaves you with is not whether caffeine is good or bad. It is, what do we owe to each other, to the landscapes that grew these plants, to the hands that picked and roasted and poured because we built so much of our shared life around staying awake. Maybe the next time you stir sugar into your coffee, you'll think of cane fields in Jamaica and boilers in Barbados. Maybe when you drink a deep floral Ethiopia, you'll remember rust epidemics and breeding trials. Maybe when someone offers you tea, you'll catch a faint echo of Tang scholars, song exam candidates, British gunboats, and Indian plantation workers. Maybe when you reach for chocolate, you'll remember cacao pods painted in Maya glyphs, beans counted in tribute lists, and children carrying sacks in West African forests. None of that has to sour the cup. It can deepen it. Because rituals are not just habits, they're stories we repeat with our bodies until they feel natural. Caffeine's story is still being written in trade talks, in climate models, in lab notebooks, in union meetings, in cafes that double as co-ops, in homes where a parent still says, "Sit, have some coffee." as if that tiny offer could momentarily hold the world together. At the Forbidden Dispensary, we read those stories in the steam. We traced the lines from berry to brain, from hillside to ledger, from kettle to courtroom. Not to ruin your drink, but to remind you that even the smallest pleasures are braided into something vast. So the next time you raise that cup, whatever it holds, pause for a heartbeat. Taste the bitterness, the sweetness, the heat. Taste, if you can, the centuries, and then take your sip, fully awake.